Tekken is one of the longest-running fighting game franchises in history. 30 years, 8 mainline entries, and a family feud so convoluted it makes the Greek gods look well-adjusted. Today, I'm breaking down the complete Tekken timeline from the very first punch thrown in 1994 to the chaos of Tekken 8, starting with a game that had no business becoming a dynasty, Tekken. In 1994, a little arcade cabinet showed up and quietly changed fighting games forever. Tekken hit arcades running on custom Namco hardware that made it one of the most technically impressive machines you could sit down at. While Street Fighter had the entire genre locked down in 2D, Tekken looked at that and said, cool, what if we added a whole extra dimension? And here's the thing, this wasn't some massive roster brawler. The original Tekken had 8 playable characters. That's it. Kazuya, Jack, King, Yoshimitsu, Armor King, Kuma, Law, and Anna. You could fit the entire cast on a single poster and still have room for the logo. For context, modern fighting games launch with triple that, and people still complain about the roster being too small. But those 8 characters were enough to introduce the concept that would drive the entire franchise for 3 decades. The King of Iron Fist tournament, a fighting tournament hosted by Heihachi Mishima, patriarch of the Mishima clan, a family whose idea of bonding is throwing each other off cliffs. Kazuya enters the tournament specifically to fight his own father. Not for money, not for glory, just pure generational resentment turned into a bracket. When the PlayStation 1 port dropped in December 1995, it brought that arcade experience into living rooms worldwide. Suddenly, millions of players were learning about the Mishima bloodline, and nobody, absolutely nobody, could have predicted that this simple tournament premise would spiral into a saga involving devils, genetic curses, and at least 3 separate Apocalypse Iosas scenarios. The game was small. The ambitions were modest. 8 fighters and a family grudge. That's all it took to build a 30-year empire. But Tekken 2 would take that foundation and turn it into something far more ambitious, starting with a roster that more than doubled overnight. Tekken 2. Here's the thing about Tekken 2. Most people remember it as the one with more characters. And sure, the roster jumped from 8 to 25, which is a pretty significant leap for a sequel that dropped just 1 year after the original. Arcade cabinets got it in 1995. PlayStation owners had it by 1996. But the roster expansion isn't what made this game important, not even close. What made Tekken 2 matter is something that's easy to take for granted now, because it's so baked into the franchise's DNA that people forget how much it elevated the formula. Fully rendered cinematic character endings that didn't just celebrate your win, but actually deepened the lore. Now, other fighting games had individual endings before this. Street Fighter 2 and Mortal Kombat both gave characters unique story conclusions back in the early 90s, but those were mostly still images, text crawls, maybe a short animation. Cool, thanks. Very meaningful. Tekken 2 looked at that and said, we're going further. Every single character got their own cinematic ending sequence. And while not all of them were treated as canon, the ones that were carried real weight. They set up rivalries. They established motivations. They created plot threads that would carry forward into Tekken 3, 4, 5, and beyond. The game pushed the idea that a fighting game's story should feel like it mattered, told one character at a time, through the simple act of winning, and I can prove how much this mattered. The Mishima revenge narrative, the thing that defines this franchise for the next 3 decades, started in Tekken 1 with Kazuya throwing Heihachi off a cliff, but Tekken 2 is where it got its real scaffolding. Kazuya's descent into darkness, Heihachi's scheming, the Devil Gene's growing influence, all of it deepened and formalized through these ending sequences. Players weren't just learning combos anymore, they were piecing together a family saga built on betrayal, supernatural power, and an alarming amount of cliff throwing. Let me be clear, no other fighting game in 1995 was producing cinematics at this level of ambition for its story delivery. Tekken 2 quietly raised the bar for what narrative presentation in a fighting game could look like, and it did it on a PlayStation 1 with polygon characters that had roughly 14 triangles per face. But if Tekken 2 laid the foundation, Tekken 3 burned the house down and rebuilt it from scratch. Tekken 3. Namco did something in 1997 that no fighting game developer in their right mind would ever attempt. They killed the protagonist, not in a cutscene, not as a fake out. They literally removed Kazuya Mishima from the playable roster, jumped the story forward an entire decade to 2005, and handed the keys to his teenage son, Jin, a character nobody had ever heard of, in a genre where roster loyalty is everything. everything. Where players will boycott a game because their main got nerfed, Namco retired multiple fan favorites and said, "Trust us." And here's the thing, it worked. Tekken 3 hit arcades in September 1997 and the PlayStation in July 1998, and it didn't just survive the backlash, it became the creative peak of the entire franchise. The roster expanded to over 23 characters, but the real story was who wasn't there. Legacy fighters were gone, replaced by newcomers like Eddie Gordo, Hwoarang, and Xiaoyu, characters that played nothing like the old guard. People walked up to arcade cabinets, scrolled through the select screen, and genuinely couldn't believe what they were seeing. "Where's my guy? What do you mean he's not in the game?" But Namco wasn't just being reckless. They were rebuilding. The combat engine got a fundamental overhaul with the introduction of sidestepping, a mechanic that let players dodge laterally for the first time. Sounds simple? It wasn't. Sidestepping completely restructured how high-level Tekken worked. Suddenly, every attack had a spatial dimension. You weren't just thinking about timing anymore, you were thinking about angles. It turned the game from a back-and-forth lane into an actual arena, and competitive play has never been the same since. Then, there's the lore bombshell. Kazuya wasn't just dead. He was alive, possessed by a supernatural entity called Devil. Everything players thought they understood about the Mishima bloodline conflict, the father-son rivalry, the tournament grudges, all of it got reframed as something darker, something not entirely human. The Devil gene wasn't just a plot device. It became the spine of the entire franchise going forward. Tekken 3 is what happens when a developer bets everything on reinvention and actually pulls it off. But pulling it off created a new problem. Where do you go after your creative peak? Turns out, you throw canon out the window entirely. Tekken Tag Tournament. Here's the thing about Tekken Tag Tournament. It doesn't matter. Literally none of it is canon. Not a single fight, not a single outcome, not one dramatic slow-motion knockout means anything to the actual Tekken timeline. And somehow, that's exactly why everyone loves it. After 3 games of family betrayal, cliff throwing, and demonic possession, Namco decided the franchise deserved a party. And what a party it was. Over 40 playable characters pulled from every corner of the series, dead or alive, villain or hero, all thrown into a 2 versus 2 tag team blender with zero narrative justification. Kazuya fighting alongside the guy who threw him off a cliff? Sure. 2 different versions of the same character on one team? Why not? There were no rules because there was no story, just vibes. The tag out system was the real star here. Mid-combo, you could swap your fighter for their part, extending combos in ways that felt genuinely new. It wasn't just a gimmick either. These tag mechanics planted seeds that would grow into core design philosophy for future entries. Namco was experimenting, and the experiment worked, but the timing is what really made this game legendary. Tekken Tag Tournament hit arcades in September 1999 and landed on the PlayStation 2 in March 2000 as one of the console's marquee launch titles. If you bought a PS2 in that launch window, there's a solid chance this was the first disc you put in the tray. For millions of players, Tekken Tag Tournament wasn't just a fighting game, it was the reason they owned a PS2, and honestly, it looked incredible for the time. Namco used it as a full technical showcase for what the PS2 could do, and the answer was, make fighting games look really, really good. Character models were sharper, animations were smoother, and stages had a level of detail that made the PlayStation 1 era look like finger paintings. It was a tech demo disguised as a celebration, disguised as a fighting game. No story mode, no canonical weight, no consequences whatsoever. Just the entire Tekken roster having the time of their lives. It's the franchise's victory lap, and it earned every second of it. But the party had to end eventually, because Tekken 4 was about to try something very different, and not everyone was going to be happy about it. Tekken 4 almost killed the franchise. And I'm not being dramatic. This is the game that made the competitive community genuinely consider walking away from Tekken forever. Released in arcades in 2001 and hitting the PlayStation 2 in 2002, Tekken 4 set its story somewhere around 2005 to 2007 and featured 23 playable characters. On paper, that sounds fine. In practice, Namco decided to take everything players loved about Tekken 3 and Tag Tournament and throw it directly into a wood chipper. Here's the thing, the developers wanted to innovate. They wanted Tekken to feel more realistic, more grounded, more dynamic. so they introduced uneven stage terrain. Floors had slopes, walls closed in on you. Environmental hazards could literally change the outcome of a match. They overhauled the combo system so dramatically that years of muscle memory and classic strategies became completely useless overnight. They introduced Combat, a customizable fighter that could copy moves from other characters, which sounds cool until you realize the entire mechanical foundation underneath him was broken. And look, innovation is great. Nobody wants a franchise to stagnate, but there's a difference between pushing boundaries and pushing your entire player base off a cliff. The blocking system felt wrong. Movement felt restricted. Matches that used to be about reads and spacing suddenly came down to who got stuck in a corner against a wall they couldn't escape. Veterans who had spent years mastering Tekken's fundamentals loaded up Tekken 4, played 3 matches, and said no thank you with a politeness I'm being generous in assuming. The competitive scene didn't just cool off, it nearly evaporated. Tournament attendance dropped, community forums turned into complaint threads. For a franchise that had been on an unbroken winning streak since 1994, this was genuinely unprecedented. Now, credit where it's due. Tekken 4 tried things. The story mode was actually decent. The atmosphere was moody and interesting. Some fans genuinely love this game to this day, and they're not wrong too. But the fighting game community doesn't grade on artistic intent. They grade on whether the game is fun to play competitively, and the verdict was brutal. How brutal? Well, when Tekken 5 came out, it reversed nearly every major mechanical change Tekken 4 introduced. Flat stages came back, classic movement returned. The combo system was rebuilt from the ground up. That's not a sequel evolving naturally. That's a developer looking at the damage report and hitting the undo button as fast as humanly possible. But that undo button? It produced something incredible. Tekken 5. After the disaster that was Tekken 4's competitive reception, Namco did something that massive game studios almost never do. They listened, and then they actually fixed it. Tekken 5 hit arcades in November 2004 and PlayStation 2 in 2005. And from the moment players got their hands on it, the message was crystal clear. This was classic Tekken. Fast, aggressive, mechanically tight, and built from the ground up to reward the people who'd stuck with the franchise through its awkward experimental phase. The roster packed in 32 characters, bringing back legacy fighters that Tekken 4 had either sidelined or straight up ignored. Fan favorites who'd been collecting dust since Tekken 3 were suddenly back in the rotation like nothing happened. It was like Namco walked into the arcade, looked the community dead in the eyes, and said, "We're sorry, here's everyone you missed. Please stop being mad at us." But here's the thing, it wasn't just a nostalgia play. They didn't just revert to Tekken 3 and call it a day. The crush system was the proof. Remember how Tekken 4's low block mechanics basically broke competitive play? Crouch, block low, wait for your opponent to get bored and make a mistake. Riveting stuff. The crush system solved that by giving certain moves the ability to automatically evade or power through attacks based on your character's motion. You couldn't just turtle your way to victory anymore. You had to actually engage. You had to actually fight, which is, the entire point of a fighting game. The arcade reception wasn't just positive, it was salvation level. Tekken 5 didn't just recover the franchise's competitive reputation, it became the tournament standard globally. Arcades that had quietly shelved their Tekken 4 cabinets were suddenly packed again. Tournament organizers who'd been drifting toward other fighters came back. Players who'd written the series off entirely picked up a controller and realized Namco had pulled off the impossible. The competitive scene didn't just revive, it exploded, and Namco kept pushing. Tekken 5.1 dropped as an arcade update with dedicated balance changes, proving this wasn't a one-and-done apology tour. They were actively maintaining competitive integrity, tweaking frame data based on real tournament feedback. For a franchise that had nearly lost its entire competitive player base one game earlier, that commitment meant everything. The story continued the Mishima saga right where Tekken 4 left off, advancing the generational blood feud while keeping the gameplay rooted in what made Tekken great. Smart innovation layered on top of proven fundamentals. No gimmicks, no stage hazards, no reinventing the wheel because someone at Namco got bored on a Tuesday. Just a fighting game that respected its audience enough to give them exactly what they wanted, then quietly added depth they didn't know they needed. But Namco wasn't done refining, because Tekken 5 was about to get an upgrade that would push it from great to genuinely legendary. Tekken 5, Dark Resurrection. So Tekken 5 was already great, we've established that. But Namco looked at it and said, yeah, we can do better, and then they actually did. Dark Resurrection hit arcades in September 2005, and it wasn't a sequel. It was Tekken 5 with every rough edge sanded down, every imbalance addressed, and a handful of new fighters thrown in for good measure. This is the version competitive players actually remember when they talk about Tekken 5. The The original was the foundation. Dark Resurrection was the house. The roster expanded to over 36 characters, and the most notable addition was Lily de Rochefort, a rich Monegasque teenager who fights with a ballet-inspired style because, you know, that's a completely normal hobby for a billionaire's daughter. Lily became an instant fan favorite and an equally instant source of competitive frustration. Her evasive movement and counter-hit game made her a nightmare to deal with online, and the debate over whether she was genuinely overpowered or just annoying has never fully been resolved. Some arguments are eternal. The story mode got expanded too, with deeper character interactions and additional narrative scenes that fleshed out individual arcs beyond what vanilla Tekken 5 offered. It wasn't revolutionary storytelling by any stretch, but it gave players a reason to run through the mode with every character on the roster instead of just their main. Here's the thing that doesn't get talked about enough though. Dark Resurrection went through multiple arcade update iterations, versions 1.0 through 1.3, each one tweaking frame data, adjusting damage values, and rebalancing matchups based on competitive play. That sounds completely normal now. Every fighting game does live balance patches, but in 2005, this was genuinely forward-thinking. Namco was essentially running a live service model before the term existed, using arcade operators as the delivery system instead of internet updates. The iterative patching philosophy that defines modern competitive games started in cabinets like these. Then, in March 2007, Dark Resurrection landed on PlayStation 3, and it proved something the industry had been skeptical about for years. You could take an arcade game and port it to a home console without gutting the mechanics. The PS3 version maintained full mechanical integrity, frame-perfect inputs, identical hitboxes, the whole package. It sounds basic now, but this was the proof of concept that changed how fighting game developers approached console releases permanently. Before Dark Resurrection, Arcade Perfect was marketing language. After it, the expectation became standard, a polished, balanced, mechanically pristine fighting game. But Namco wasn't done pushing the franchise forward. Tekken 6 would introduce a system so controversial, it's still causing arguments nearly 2 decades later. Tekken 6? Tekken 6 introduced a single mechanic that split the entire community in half, and it's still causing arguments to this day. The Rage system. Simple concept. When your health drops below a certain threshold, your attacks get stronger. You glow red, you hit harder, and suddenly that round you were losing. It's not over yet. On paper, it sounds like a perfectly reasonable comeback mechanic. In practice, it meant that a player who was outperforming their opponent for 90% of the round could lose to 2 powered-up hits at the end. Competitive players lost their minds. Casual players loved it, and Bandai Namco looked at both groups, shrugged, and made it a permanent franchise mechanic from that point forward, which is, not ideal for the people who hated it. But here's the thing. Whether you love Rage or despise it, you can't deny it fundamentally changed how Tekken rounds play out. Every match now has a built-in dramatic arc. You're never truly safe with a health lead, and you're never truly dead when you're behind. It turned every close round into a spectator event. The competitive community argued it rewarded losing. The casual community argued it rewarded clutch play. Both were kinda right. Beyond the mechanical controversy, Tekken 6 made a much bigger statement about what the franchise wanted to be. The scenario campaign mode was the series' first real attempt at cinematic storytelling. Not just arcade mode endings with 30 seconds of CGI, an actual narrative campaign with cutscenes, dialogue, and a story that tried to tie the entire Mishima bloodline together. Was it perfect? Absolutely not. The beat-em-up gameplay sections felt clunky, and the AI companions had the survival instincts of a wet napkin. But the ambition was real, and it laid the groundwork for everything Tekken 7 would eventually accomplish with its story. The roster ballooned to over 40 characters, and the story escalated the Mishima family conflict to genuinely global stakes. Jin Kazama literally starts a world war using the Mishima Zaibatsu, dragging every character into a conflict that made previous Tekken tournaments look like family picks. These weren't small narrative steps. The franchise was swinging for the fences, planting seeds for payoffs that wouldn't fully land until Tekken 7 years later. Tekken 6, Bloodline Rebellion dropped in arcades in December 2008, overhauling character balance and adding new fighters like Lars and Alisa. The console ports followed in late 2009 on PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360, giving the arcade scene roughly a year's head start on refining the meta. The game pushed the timeline forward and escalated the Mishima family war to a scale the series had never attempted. Tekken was no longer content being just a fighting game with good mechanics. It wanted to be dramatic, it wanted to be cinematic, and for better or worse, Tekken 6 was the moment that decision became permanent. But if Tekken 6 decided the franchise needed drama, the next entry decided it needed a vacation from canon entirely. Tekken Tag Tournament 2. If the first tag tournament was a reunion, Tag Tournament 2 was the entire family tree showing up at once. Every single one one of them. 50+ playable characters, all crammed into one game, making it the largest roster in Tekken history at that point, and none of it was canon, which meant Namco could do literally whatever they wanted. The game hit arcades in September 2011 before landing on PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 in September 2012, and the pitch was simple. Take every fighter from every era of Tekken, put them all in the same room, and let players go absolutely feral with team compositions. Characters who were dead in the main timeline, playable. Characters who hadn't been seen since Tekken 3, right there on the select screen. Legacy fighters standing next to newcomers like they'd always been neighbors. It was less of a fighting game and more of a playable encyclopedia. The tag mechanics themselves got a serious overhaul from the original tag tournament. Character synergy actually mattered now. You couldn't just pick two random fighters and mash your way through. Team composition had real strategic depth, with tag combos, tag throws, and partner-specific interactions that rewarded players for understanding how their duo worked together. It was the thinking person's party game, if the party involved suplexing a bear into a dinosaur. But here's where it gets interesting. Namco also went all in on character customization this time around. Hats, accessories, full outfit swaps, ridiculous cosmetic nonsense that let you turn serious martial artists into walking fashion disasters. It sounds trivial, but it signaled something important. The franchise was leaning hard into player expression. Your Tekken experience didn't have to look like anyone else's. Behind the scenes, the arcade version went through iterative updates from version 1.0 all the way through 1.3 across 2011 and 2012, with Namco constantly tweaking balance and refining matchups. When you've got 50+ characters to keep in check, that's not a patch cycle. That's a full-time job. The original Tag Tournament gave us around 40 characters, and it felt massive. Tag Tournament 2 looked at that number and said those are rookie numbers. It was celebratory, excessive, and a little bit wistful, because in hindsight, this was the last time Tekken would just let loose and have fun without worrying about canon consequences. A send-off to everything the series had built over nearly 2 decades, all playable in one place, which makes it the perfect farewell before the franchise decided to get deadly serious again, because Tekken 7 wasn't interested in celebrating the past, it was interested in ending it. Tekken 7, 23 years. That's how long the Mishima family had been throwing each other off cliffs, shooting each other with satellites, and generally making Thanksgiving dinner look like a war zone. And Tekken 7 finally said, alright, let's end this. The game hit arcades between 2014 and 2015, with the full console release landing on June 2nd, 2017 for PS4, Xbox One, and PC. The story is set in 2019, and it came packing an expanded episode prologue, story mode that had one very specific mission: resolve the Mishima saga once and for all. But before we get to how it ends, let's talk about how it reframes everything, because Tekken 7 pulled one of the boldest narrative moves in fighting game history. It introduced Kazumi Mishima, Heihachi's wife, the woman we'd heard almost nothing about for over 2 decades. Turns out, she's the reason everything went wrong. Kazumi carried the devil gene. She married into the Mishima bloodline and passed that curse directly to Kazuya, which means every single horrible thing that happened across this entire timeline, every betrayal, every demonic transformation, every volcano and cliff and corporate takeover, traces back to her. The story reveals that Heihachi killed Kazumi after she tried to assassinate him, and that act of violence is what broke him. He threw Kazuya off that cliff not out of cruelty for cruelty's sake, but because he was terrified his son carried the same curse his mother did. Does that justify it? Absolutely not, but it recontextualizes the entire saga. Heihachi goes from cartoonish villain to tragic monster in the span of one game. That's genuinely impressive writing for a franchise where a bear has been a tournament competitor since 1994. The roster launched with 37 characters and ballooned to over 50 through 3 years of post-launch DLC seasons, which kept the competitive scene fed with fresh matchups and constant meta shifts. Mechanically, the rage system got refined with the new rage dash technique, letting players push forward aggressively during their powered-up state instead of just sitting on a rage yard and waiting. It rewarded offense, it rewarded confidence, and it made for incredible tournament moments. Speaking of tournaments, this is where Tekken finally got its flowers. Tekken 7 achieved legitimate esports status with global professional circuits, including EVO, the PlayStation Pro League, and the ESL Pro Series. Fighting games had always been competitive, but Tekken 7 turned that competition into a spectator sport. Millions of viewers, sponsored players, production value that would have been unthinkable during the Tekken 3 arcade days. The franchise went from that game at the arcade to a globally broadcast competitive platform. And here's what makes Tekken 7 genuinely special in the context of this entire timeline. It tried to end the story, not tease the next chapter, not leave a cliffhanger for Tekken 8. It treated the Mishima saga like a story with a conclusion. Heihachi and Kazuya have their final battle. One of them dies. The narrator closes the book. For the first time in the franchise's history, the credits rolled, and it felt like an ending, not a comma. Of course, you can't keep a Mishima down forever, and the saga that was supposedly finished, it had one more chapter left. Tekken 8, here's the thing nobody wants to talk about. Tekken 7 ended, like actually ended. The Mishima saga, the blood feud that had been driving this franchise since 1994, got its conclusion. Heihachi Mishima, the man who threw his own son off a cliff and somehow became gaming's most iconic terrible father, was finally, definitively dealt with. Story over. Credits roll. 30 years of family therapy wrapped up in a volcano. So how do you make Tekken 8? That's not a rhetorical question. That's the actual design problem Bandai Namco had to solve. You can't just pretend the ending didn't happen. You can't pull a, it was all a dream. The audience watched the conclusion. They felt it. And now you're asking them to buy another ticket to a show that already had its curtain call. The answer, it turns out, was to stop asking what happens next and start asking who Tekken is actually for. Tekken 8 launched on January 26th. 2024 across PS5, Xbox Series XS, and PC. It shipped with 32 playable characters and post-launch DLC seasons already mapped out. Visually, the thing is absurd. The next-generation graphics engine delivers character models and stage detail that make Tekken 7 look like it was rendered on a calculator. Every pore, every particle effect during a rage drive is operating at a level the series has never touched. But the real story isn't the graphics. It's the controller. Tekken 8 introduced a dual control philosophy that split the community down the middle. On one side, Special Style, a simplified control mode designed to let newcomers actually participate without memorizing 47 input combinations for a basic combo. On the other side, Tekken Pro Mode, the full mechanical depth that competitive players have spent decades mastering. Same game, two completely different ways to play it, and the debate has been, to put it mildly, intense. Competitive purists argue that Special Style dilutes the game's integrity, that Tekken's identity has always been built on execution barriers, on the gap between someone who knows their character and someone who doesn't. I spent 400 hours learning electrics, and now some guy can press one button. That's the energy. But here's the counter-argument, and it's not a small one. Fighting games have been bleeding players for years. The genre's biggest problem has never been depth. It's been the cliff face new players hit in the first 30 minutes. You can have the most mechanically brilliant game ever made, but if nobody sticks around long enough to discover that brilliance, you've built a museum that nobody visits. Special Style isn't dumbing Tekken down. It's building a door where there used to be a wall, and that might be the most important design decision in the franchise's history. More important than rage, more important than sidestepping, because it's not a mechanical addition, it's a philosophical statement about what fighting games need to be in order to survive. Tekken 8 is saying, out loud, that accessibility and depth aren't enemies. They're the same thing viewed from different angles. The story mode continues the Mishima saga despite Tekken 7's apparent closure, which is either brave or stubborn depending on who you ask. The bloodline keeps going. The fists stay iron. And 30 years after Kazuya got thrown off that cliff, the franchise built on family violence is still finding new ways to justify its existence. Not all franchises get to say that. Most don't make it past a decade. Tekken has survived bad entries, genre shifts, the death of arcades, and the near extinction of fighting games as a mainstream category, and it's still here, still swinging. 30 years of iron fists. The bloodline continues. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.